Mrs. Tamara van Breugel is a person who has been involved in themes of human rights and citizen rights and citizen empowerment for many years. I met her not long ago, and we had long conversations about subjects, those kind of subjects. And more recently, she has led a great effort to open a chapter in Bahamas of Transparency International. And I have heard with great pleasure that it's going in the right direction and gathering a lot of support. So to speak about governance, which is how citizens can exercise their right to control government, which is supposed to be at their service, Tamara is going to tell us about governance in general in the Bahamian and regional perspective. With you, Tamara van Breugel.
Good morning. Today we're going to speak about the need for transparency in a developing society. As you've heard, my name is Tamara van Breugel, and I am a curious, concerned, and engaged citizen of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I am not an expert on economics or governance, but I do care deeply about my nation's development, and I have devoted a great deal of interest to the discovery of what factors make some small and developing societies stagnate and what makes others thrive. While the combinations of potential factors are diverse and non-conclusive, certain headliners like education, infrastructure, balance of trade, population density, access to justice, and productivity seem to continually recur. I would like to single out, however, one theme that I believe undergirds these social ideals and is the catalyst for authentic growth and development of any modern civilization attempting to integrate into the global landscape. That theme is a culture of openness and transparency. Before I could properly consider the concept of transparency and its potential benefits for a developing society, I spent a great deal of time trying to lay down some clear definition and context around these widely used but often under-considered terms. For this, I found two sources of illumination that I believe are at the forefront of thought and action on the principles of international transparency agenda. So, what is transparency and why is it important? According to Article 19.org, everyone has the right to freedom of expression, and this includes the right to seek, impart, and receive information. This right to freedom of information is key to achieving many other rights, securing democracy, enabling development. And according to transparencyinitiative.org, as a principle, public officials, civil servants, managers, and directors of companies and organizations and board trustees have a duty to act visibly, predictably, and understandably to promote participation and accountability. From these sources, we learn firstly that access to information is considered to be a fundamental human right. We learn secondly that the provision of information is considered to be a principle-based duty of those in authority. Under the weight of much national and international demand, the Bahamas has made the first bold steps toward more transparent governance with the introduction of a draft Freedom of Information Act. It's currently in circulation for public commentary. While it is an impressive revision to the aborted first attempt to bring this legislation, the features of the current draft bill still face skepticism on whether they actually keep pace with the current international benchmarks for rights to information. The question then lingers: can we do more, and why should we try? The Bahamas is officially considered a small island developing state. And so it's a fitting subject on which we can contemplate the potential outcomes that a culture of transparency might engender in similar developing societies. According to a United Nations source, small island developing states share very high levels of intrinsic vulnerabilities, especially to external shocks. These high levels of vulnerability of the natural, economic, and social systems of small island developing states arise from the following characteristics: small size, remoteness, vulnerability to external, i.e. demand and supply side shocks, narrow resource base, exposure to global environmental challenges. In addition to these structural impediments, many developing states face the legacy issues arising from a post-colonial existence. These legacy structures of external dominance imprint a pattern on developing economies that notable scholar Fred Riggs termed as formalism. In societies impacted by this phenomenon, there exists a widespread discrepancy between the rules as prescribed versus the rules as practiced. Public servants and bureaucratic officials in these societies will take great pains to emphasize the absolute authority and rectitude of the law when delivering services to the people. However, when their own professional actions are scrutinized, they are found to be far astray from the prescribed rules, laws, and regulations. Such systems are hard-pressed to drive authentic development because they have been designed to serve the goals of external colonizing interests rather than to be responsive to the dynamic needs and progress of the people. Facing such challenges, it's easy to understand why small developing states are immediately disadvantaged in the competition for global participation against larger counterparts. But in every challenge, I believe one must search relentlessly for the opportunity. Let's take a look. So what do these small developing societies need most to survive in the global marketplace? Primarily, these economies need external capital inflows to finance their economic and infrastructural development. These external flows, however, must be carefully counterbalanced by deliberate internal actions for phased reductions on such external dependencies. Next, these societies need to create safeguards around the long-term viability and resilience. For this, they must place great emphasis on the development of sustainable ecologies and the advancement of social responsibilities. There is no longer the luxury left for small developing societies to turn back or to stall the hands of time. Since the advent of the information age, the race for global significance and capital flow has intensified, and the field of competitors has widened. The only logical choice, then, is to sprint forward as a whole society to meet these global demands. In light of all this, the solution that I advance to you today is that an authentic and consistent culture of transparency and accountability is the fastest route for such a disadvantaged developing society to get to the table of international consideration. Let us now look at how the introduction of a culture of transparency can make short work out of the type of social promotion these developing states so desperately need. Transparency and foreign direct investment. The U.S. State Department's 2015 Investment Climate Report on the Bahamas advised potential investors to the Bahamas of the significant challenges in doing business in this nation. Some of the highlights include the confusing and opaque nature of government approvals, with many permits and licenses open to discretion in their awards. The failure to initiate a single prosecution under the Prevention of Bribery Act, despite the widespread reports of corruption that have circulated in the Bahamas for decades. These highlights from this report make plain the inextricable connection between practical transparency, the perception of transparency, and the volume and quality of investor interest and capital inflow to a jurisdiction. It should also make evident the urgent nature in which these small developing nations should move to spawn diverse, sustainable domestic industries and export opportunities, thereby reducing potential dependency-based volatility in the future. In order to move forward, the Bahamas must now be prepared to undergo a tremendous paradigm shift, which would require a dedicated national commitment to engender new technological and industrial endeavors. The next question then is, could a culture of transparency add momentum to the twin engines of industry, those being innovation and productivity? Transparency and innovation. Innovation is certainly the most significant driver of authentic value creation in every area of modern development. It spurs new inventions, births new industries, develops more efficient processes, and consistently thrusts the human race ever further along in its journey to stronger, faster, better. Author and entrepreneur Margaret Heffernan suggests, for good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, and debate. Societies that want to boost their innovative quotient would need to seek ways to stimulate and sustain a consistent flow of human interaction, dialogue, and discussion to solve their biggest problems and find opportunities that they never knew existed. A culture of transparency and openness is the only platform on which such a dynamic interface could occur. Transparency and productivity. If innovation is the key to progress and development, then productivity is certainly the ignition. The world's greatest economies have expertly harnessed the skill of converting inputs into increasingly higher units of useful output. Increases to productivity can serve a society by lowering the cost of living, improving the standard of living, and creating more income. In the context of the state, a transparency culture delivers direct efficiency and productivity results, enabling cost reductions through the streamlining of various state activities, providing better and faster service, and improving the services themselves. In the human context, a transparency culture fosters participation and trust and drives directly to the basis of increased human motivation and engagement. A culture of transparency and accountability, then, becomes the launchpad on which to boost the productivity of developing societies. Now let's look at transparency and the environment. The need for immediate and determined action to secure the economic stability and resilience for small island developing states is perhaps only matched by their urgent need to secure the preservation and sustainability of their ecological environments. In a statement to the United Nations Climate Summit in 2014, Prime Minister of the Bahamas, the Right Honorable Perry G. Christie, exclaimed, 80% of my nation's landmass will be lost if the sea level rises 1.5 meters. They also say that with a warming of 3.7 to 4.8 degrees centigrade by the year 2100, as currently predicted, the Bahamas, we know, would be no more. In the face of such seemingly grave external environmental threats, the Bahamas has also faced its own share of internal environmental scrutiny. Environmentalists have been at the forefront of an uphill and at times expensive battle, and often against the government itself, in their quest for basic information to support their work. Following the discovery that government agencies had shielded from the public for more than a year a report that disclosed public health implications relating to an underground fuel leak, notable Bahamian attorney and environmentalist Romuald Ferreira expressed both his frustration and his optimism when he stated, "It's like an infection that presents in many different ways, but the infection is the same," he said. "The root cause is a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency. The infection, in this case, is that there is no accountability and there is no transparency. So I am identifying a root cause to arrive at a solution." This is an idea that we have to embrace, that this is the next logical step. I'm saying that idea of no accountability and no transparency, that can change. Transparency and social justice. The colonial vestiges of centralized power structures and dependent masses are key themes still impacting many island developing states today. The majority of people in these societies are reinforced in their belief that the state is ultimately responsible for their well-being and prosperity. These ideals are fortified by the centralized nature of institutions and perpetuated by some in leadership who build their power base on this dependency culture. The inherent challenge of small developing economies is the unsustainable scenario this dependency arrangement creates, as their relative GDP per capita cannot fund such broad-based social provisioning systems indefinitely. To compound this issue, the extended costs of systemic political patronage generate a high degree of wasteful, pork barrel spending on infrastructural and social initiatives that drive little to no social benefit. In the end, the poorest and the weakest in these societies received diminished social safety net services and higher costs of living, which further chain them to the dependency culture and regenerates the vicious cycle of wasteful big government spending. A culture of openness and transparency is the first bold step for small, developing economies to devolve power from these obsolete, centralized structures by empowering citizens with enough information to guard against future manipulation. It will also diminish the recurrence of social injustice at the most fundamental levels by creating pathways to evaluate the efficacy of government spending and to detect waste and influence hoarding. So then, how could we foster a culture of transparency? Many Bahamians fundamentally acknowledge the benefits that a culture of transparency could deliver to society. But they continually question, well, what can we do? And then ultimately, they do nothing. To be clear, only determined, focused, human action will provoke the type of paradigm shift needed for the Bahamas to authentically plunge into the fast-moving stream of global opportunity. Unfortunately, in the case of the Bahamas, the majority of the people are overwhelmingly preoccupied with chasing the cycle of dependency for mere survival. To break this cycle, a dramatic intervention of knowledge and empowerment is required, and a new culture of transparency and accountability must be born. Citizens for a Better Bahamas is a group of individuals of which I am proud to be a part. It is a national civil society organization that has committed itself to the cause of enlightenment, enrichment, and empowerment of its society. Over the last few days, Citizens for a Better Bahamas has launched a transparency initiative and cemented a cooperation agreement with Transparency International, the world's foremost global anti-corruption NGO. It is our hope that with the help and support of every man, woman, and child that truly loves the Bahamas, that we can succeed in our mission to develop a more transparent and accountable society. In effect, a better Bahamas. Please consider joining us and supporting us in our national dialogue for progress, freedom, empowerment, and justice for all the people of this fair Bahama land. Thank you.
Before opening the floor to questions, I'd like to say a few words. I am a resident in Bahamas. I have been welcome here. 8 years I've been in Bahamas. And I came here from a small country to a smaller country to get a better future for me and my family. And the reason is that a phenomenon that is eternal, which is the battle between freedom and power, in my country has become really bad for people who love freedom. Bahamas is a small country, but freedom was born in small societies. After the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a great decentralization of power, and in small cities is where the spirit of freedom started to grow again. And after that became the time for ideas to start flourishing under that spirit of freedom. And we have the 18th century of the great ideas and revolutions. And then we have the century of progress, which was the 19th century, where starvation was a thing of the past, and people start migrating, and growth became incredible in terms of rates, and the world was united in this. The 20th century has been a great step back. Despite all the technological progress, it has been the century of war and the growth of power and the state to levels unimaginable. The death of tens of millions of people are basically brushed aside. It's not taught at school. And I do believe that if there is a chance for freedom in the 21st century and after, it's going to be in small societies. And they have to fight this tendency of power through the government to grow in size and grow in, let's say, in authority or in lack of transparency. So there are two areas which are important to control: the growth of government into every area of society, and second, the growth of government in terms of its lack of transparency. And that's why I think we should pay very, very much attention to the message that Tamara has just presented. I do hope that I am right and there is a rebirth of freedom in the small societies, because I look at bigger societies and big nation states and I cannot see anything but going in the wrong direction. And now I'd like to open the floor to any questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate both presentations. And I guess my question is, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it, maybe there is and I'm overlooking it, is how do you get this message across? In a democratic societies, and I think we sort of alluded to that even in the United States, that there are so many other elements of the public to try and bring in to change this current status that we both have, both countries have, that I don't know how we tackle this change. People here seem to be apathetic towards change and doing certain things, and I'm not sure how we motivate those people. There's a different class of people, there's a lower level of incomes, there's lower levels of education, so how do you successfully hope to get your message across? I hope you do, because if nobody starts fighting, then we are going to lose.
Well, I think you have perhaps touched on the one point that my group has discussed frequently, and we are always trying to determine ways to overcome public apathy. It is certainly significant, especially on issues that have the ability to perhaps transcend what may be considered the day-to-day priority. So one of the things that we believe is important in getting this message to penetrate down is, one, we have to be consistent and we have to go at this every day in a widespread way. And two, we have to do our best to try to connect our concepts to matters that impact people in their daily lives. So trying to help people to understand the connection between the additional costs they may pay in their energy supply and how that is then filtering back into the system to support waste or to support crony politics or to support nepotism, and really trying to tie personal issues back to these larger concepts.
Hi, Tamara, Rob Myers.
Can I add a little? Trevor, there is no shortcut. This is something that is to be done one citizen at a time. It's, I think it's one of the latest chapters of Ludwig von Mises' Human Action. He discusses the responsibility of the citizen. If you ignore economic subjects, if you ignore all the subjects related to governance and the scope of the state, etc., you're bound to be ruled by others. And so it has to be one citizen at a time. There is no other way. Yeah.
Just to go on from that point, open and accountable governance is also highly dependent on the enforcement and fair and enforcement, even enforcement of the rule of law, which is something that I think is being overlooked and needs to be in greater discussion within our culture. And secondly, talking about our culture, I believe that we come from an oppressive environment, and that also needs to change, because what the apathy is derived from is oppression. And until we change that environment, we are going to continue to have an apathetic society. So the enforcement and the rule of law and the apathy and the oppression are explicitly linked. And until people are held accountable by the rule of law in an open and accountable governments, you are going to continue to have these problems. And it is very complex, because they all have to work together. And that means you've got a tremendous amount of different players agreeing to a specific set of objectives moving forward. And any incumbent government is going to use those things to its advantage. And we've seen that over a period of decades in the Bahamas. And so, you know, I think it's incumbent on the citizenry to really press not only for open and accountable governance, but also fair enforcement of the rule of law and the removal of oppressive behavior.
I think, Robbie, what you're talking about relates to one thing I tried to touch on in my presentation, and it relates to this concept of formalism. And it talks about how post-colonial societies adopt a very stringent approach to law enforcement when they externalize it to the people, but it's a very loose and sort of as you like it approach when you're dealing with the purveyors of the authority. So they get to do whatever they want, they get to interpret the law however they like, but when it's time to dole it out, it's strict and it's absolute. So that's one concept that I think a lot of people who may be interested in how this dynamic has come about, you may want to explore. And the other thing you mentioned was the only way for this to change. We've been through this cycle now of electing and re-electing different people in the hopes that we're going to advance and progress our society. There have been advances, but I do not think so far there has been enough based on where the rest of the world is. I think we're lagging, and that means that the only way for us to do this is for everybody who is concerned about this society as a citizen. Let's pick up some slack and let's move it forward.
I would only add is that you should not also just be content with looking at what everybody else is doing. Small societies can, you know, leapfrog other societies because they are more nimble, easier to introduce reforms. And in certain areas, perhaps you could introduce reforms that are, you know, leading in the world, cutting edge. And I'm just thinking of monetary policy, for example. I'm thinking big. In a world that's gone crazy in terms of monetary policy, the Bahamas could go back to their initial monetary policy, who was accepting only gold and silver.
Sheep and goats. Tamara, I'd like to congratulate you on your efforts, but as you're talking and as everybody else has been talking, and I have too many notes now to even ask questions, I find it very sad that the birth of democracy in the first place was to give representation to the masses. The whole purpose of a democratic society was to be governed by the people and their voices. And we have had successive governments, not only in this country, but it's really paramount in this country, where the government no longer listens to the people. There is absolutely no trust in the government. Their power base and cronyism and the corruption, whether it's perceived or real, is so great that we tend to just put up with the fact because we don't have a choice. You know, we got to leave our country and our birthplace as a choice. We need to get this transparency and accountability. I mean, there should be a law requiring every government representative to listen to the people. If he can't listen to the people, he shouldn't be allowed to even be there. And I don't know how you do that without becoming totalitarianism government. But I would like to congratulate you on the efforts that you have. I think it becomes paramount that every Bahamian become educated, that they do have a voice. And governments should be more responsible. Instead of having rallies where they give out T-shirts and free stuff, they should have a platform. The voting in this country needs to be based on substance. And you can't get anything out of the government. And the government is the largest charity. I mean, they protect such inefficiency. You can talk energy all you want. You can talk whatever you want. But the truth of the matter is that people don't understand without the production of goods and services, there is no economy. And yet we have more non-revenue days in this country. I hope we never have another holiday issued in memory of somebody, because nothing happens on those days. And So congratulations, keep up the good work. As I said, I have too much here. It's sad that we've come out and we're now in a position where we elect a government that we don't trust. And we need to reverse that as people.
Thank you, Peter. I will only say, so that you are aware, the transparency agenda and the freedom of information agenda is just the first foothold in this journey. And we have to be very clear, going back to your original comment about the birth of democracy and the concept of being governed by the will of the people. That is a journey where we have to, as a society, go back to over time. And the transparency agenda is just that first step. Getting the information then allows us to ask better questions, then allows us to choose new actions.
Thank you. Just an observation. I think all of us would agree that we need a structural change in the way that we govern. Our government needs a change so that as politicians we are accountable to the people. And it's interesting to listen to the previous question or comment with respect to listening to the people. The reality is that with a constituency of 5,000 people, it is sometimes that we listen too much to the people. It is a very personal relationship. And as a result of that personal relationship, it pushes you into either the perceived need or the personal desire to create certain outcomes for these 5,000 people, which creates corruption, undue influence, whatever else you want to call it. And this is why it's important what you're talking about, transparency, accountability, rules that govern the conduct. I'm a proponent of less seats so that we do not have this personal relationship to the extent where I feel obligated to you as an individual versus obligated to the community. But that's a totally different thing, a radical thing. But at the end of the day, the answer to what you're trying to accomplish is a better educational system and a more educated community. If we cannot raise the level of education in our country, we will be talking about the same issue, I guarantee you, 30 years from now. Because and I want to be careful how I say it, but the lack of understanding or the level of understanding, comprehension, is just not there. And so the concepts that you're trying to bring, and you talk about the T-shirts and the chicken in the bag and the liquor and all the rest of it, the reality is that in order to be elected, you have to do it. And the only way to cause a change in the educational level and all the other things that we're talking about is to be elected. And so until you get a responsible government or responsible politicians, which is an oxymoron, you're not going to get anywhere with this. And so my only lasting comment is to keep pushing. But we've got to do first things first, and that is to cause and push for an improvement in our educational outcomes. And then we have a basis to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a great talk, Tamara. You know, we're at a point in time, like Herb Stein said, if something is unsustainable, it has to come to an end. And the next 3 years, the Bahamas as we know it will come to an end if things continue along the same lines. Now, we're talking about the rule of law. And I think it is the law, or through the law, that we're going to be able to achieve some of the changes that you're talking about. And I'll give an example. First of all, I agree with Peter. Corruption, cronyism, and nepotism is institutionalized in the Bahamas. The IDB chief economist last year gave a talk at the College of the Bahamas on GDP growth in the Caribbean. And cronyism, nepotism, and corruption were the primary causes of the decreased GDP growth. And the Bahamas is actually at the bottom of the list. Okay, so how do you use the law effectively to achieve the end that you seek to achieve? And I believe it's through the use of administrative law. And I'll give you an example. In the Bimini case, the environmental case the other day, Fred Smith used the argument that there was a procedural irregularity and therefore they should not go on with the dredging of the harbor. But the fact of the matter is that there was actually an issue with the decision made by the appellant court because there was bias. Two of the appellant court judges had strong ties to government. And it goes back to the problem that we have in the judicial system in that you have an attorney general who is a member of cabinet, but also who's head of the judicial system. And that individual has fiat over all cases. So if you have a case where the government is at odds with the environmentalists, then a biased appellant court group of judges are going to be appointed to hear the case. And it's always going to come down in favor of the government. So we need to now start to look at administrative law and use that to achieve the end that we wish to achieve. I'll give you an example of what I personally experienced myself. About 12 years ago, I applied for a license to do money transfers. And both governments said it was banking that I was trying to do. I got 5 legal opinions, 3 from the AG's office, 2 from the private sector that said it wasn't banking. And in the end, the way I got the license was I threatened to take the governor of the central bank and the head of exchange control to court on grounds of malfeasance. And members of government are not covered by the government's legal umbrella when it comes down to malfeasance. They have to pay for costs themselves. And I think that this is the route we're going to have to take, a legal route to force members of parliament, to force the government to do what they should do.
That's a really great point, Dr. Rogers, and one of the things that we have noticed as we've been doing this work and we've been trying to bring out the principles of the issues, the humanity of the issues, is that a lot of what we got hit back with was the legalism of the issues. Government relies very, very, very strongly on the legalistic approach to every interface they enter into. And they feel, I think, a strong sense of confidence that on those grounds, they will always win or make a way to win. And perhaps they rely somehow on interrelations with the judiciary to rebalance perhaps what might have been judgments that would fall in the favor of another party. But what we have to do as a society, you're recommending one approach, which is to go at these issues legally. What we also have to do as an individual, as a person who may not have the capacity to go at them individually, is to continually reinforce that not everything that is legal is right. And that is the conversation that we need to have as a society.
I totally agree. The first book I read in my long history of reading about freedom was La Loi. And that book tells you everything you need to know about the rule of law. Not every law is a good law. And this has to do with the subject I briefly mentioned about the scope of government, which is one of the key issues. One of the ways to improve government in the Bahamas is to reduce the scope, make it concentrate in those areas that are essential. And of course, courts for many people is the essential. And then if they concentrate in those areas, they would be able to have the resources to improve and to attract the best Bahamians into those areas. But if not, it's going to be just another service competing for resources and probably attracting just average people. And I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm just comparing with the experience in my country.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Mora. Robbie touched on how complex everything is, and Dr. Rogers was touching on kind of the cost of survival, is the way I would define it for the Bahamas. And leading into the transparency, for me at least, the way I'm looking at it, I'm concerned that the word was dependence that you used in your presentation, and the fact that I think more and more Bahamians that live and continue to work here have become dependent on the failing of government and the processes that exist, or the way things work today, because of the fact that the living wage is insufficient to be able to put food on the table and to pay the light bill and the rest of it. People have become dependent on the ability to negotiate around or under the table to get a tip for something you shouldn't be tipped for, to be able to, on a customs entry, to be able to put the value of goods at $1,000 less than they should be in order to save somebody some duty and put a piece of it in your pocket. And I think that the challenge, I mean, if everything was transparent, that would be a wonderful thing, but this is a very complex issue, as Robbie touched on, and it is, it's almost like a revolution that has to happen, as I see it, in society, because there is a huge segment of our population that depends on the inefficiency and on the fact that there is no transparency, and that if all of a sudden we were to throw the switch, you'd have a revolt. You'd have, I think if you look at the wages paid to teachers, the wages paid to customs officers, the wages paid to police officers, these very people that we depend on to collect taxes, to support the rule of law and so forth, are unable to survive based off the wages, yet they want everything that I want for my children. So I hope I'm alive to see it all happen.
I think you've made an interesting point, because I think you've just pinpointed the engine of closed governance, and it's not necessarily the elected officials we see cycling over every 5 years. It's easy to look at them and make them the poster child for these issues. But in reality, they're only transient. They're passing over this system that continues to exist. And what you have pinpointed in itself is the system. It is the civil service. The civil service is about 19,000 strong, and many persons in the civil service depend on the fact that they work in a closed system for their perpetuation and for their survival. They're not going to very easily acknowledge when the rest of society is banging on their doors to open up the doors and let the information fly out, because their source of power will ultimately be diminished. Of course, they may, every 5 years, work in collusion with the elected officials, because the systems obviously are being perpetuated and nobody is interrupting them. But it's interesting that you have taken the focus one layer down, because that is really where the core of the problem lies.
Well, we're going to break for lunch now. Outside, it's the food. You can then bring it in. And I'm going to present our speaker, Tamara, with a token of our appreciation. Thank you very much, Tamara.